Welcome to Sermon Brainwave with me, Joy J. Moore.
And me, Matt Skinner.
And me, Karoline Lewis.
And me, Rolf Jacobson.
Today we're doing the podcast for Maundy, Thursday for 2020, and the texts are Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, and 11 through 14, or you can read just verses 1 through 14. The psalm is 116, verses 1 and 2, and then verses 12 through 19. The epistle is from 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 through 26. And our gospel reading is from the 13th chapter of John, 1 through 17, and then 31b through 35. Karoline, are you going to start with our gospel?
Well, this year, of course, given our reality of where we are with COVID-19 and how all of Holy Week is going to be experienced differently, and how we hear these texts differently. I think we say this every year, that, or at least I know I do, is which text will you focus on in terms of that which is bringing us together? Is it going to be the foot washing, or is it going to be Holy Communion? And trying to meld all of those together, I don't know that always works, but that's just me. But I'll focus on John, and how I hear this really differently is how the love commandment, right, 31b to 35, could easily get really misconstrued this year, because we so desperately want that, or we want that. How do we love each other in times like this, especially loving each other when there's no physical contact, or there's no touching each other, but to put that love commandment back in its context with the missing verses, where right before you have the betrayal of Judas, which is not included in the lectionary text, and then immediately after the love commandment is the prediction of Peter's denial. I think it's a reminder that we love in the midst of those really poignant realities of betrayal and denial. We love in the midst of those extraordinary emotional and relational difficulties. And this text sometimes, gets misinterpreted, or even the act of foot washing gets misinterpreted when the love commandment refers immediately back to the foot washing. And if you don't include the reality of Jesus washing the feet of his betrayer and washing the feet of his denier, and then saying to his disciples, "You're going to have to do the same," you miss the kind of love that Jesus is talking about. And it's a love also, I think, that again this year I would emphasize the fact that Jesus' feet were washed first before he was able to wash the feet of his disciples. Mary anointed his feet, and to what extent her, with an abundance of perfume and her abundant love, and to what extent Jesus needed to feel that love first before he could love who would betray him and who would deny him. And so this is not a sacrificial love; it's a mutual, reciprocal love. And maybe that's a message, and that's a hope that people could hold on to on this Maundy, Thursday this year, of loving in the face of extraordinary pain and separation, and that it's okay to be loved. It's okay to love and to be loved, and that's really, really necessary right now.
And that these are very much acts of sacrificial love. And what does sacrificial love look for us in these moments? the kind of caring for one another, where even though it seems like this isolation is overkill or irrelevant, but we are doing this for the sake of others as much as for the sake of ourselves. So that's a way to actively engage in this kind of sacrificial love to our neighbor, even if we haven't appreciated that neighbor in the past.
It's another, excuse me, it's another moment for creativity on preacher's part, trying to figure out how to engage this text in current circumstances. And it's what does love look like as a public demonstration, right? As real care for the body of a neighbor, and figuring out how to do that in different ways. I think it's going to require some real vulnerability from a preacher to think about how this text gets presented. So it's not just, hey, maybe, next year we'll get back to doing this, right? Or one day we'll come back to this, but to feel like this is something that can still maybe transcend our separation, as long as we don't just make it mere metaphor, right? As long as we still find ways to figure out what does the same kind of concern look like. But the fact of rooting that in this sense of love and self-giving is, that's just, how can you not win by preaching that if you're going to do a sermon on this text?
Well, and I think also it's one of the things that I think helps with this preaching this text right now is that the love commandment is, as it's called, it doesn't have to be, the reference doesn't necessarily have to be only the foot washing. I think that's one of the things that kind of gets misinterpreted about this text, that Jesus says, love others as I have loved you, and so therefore go wash people's feet. That's not the correlation. And so really what that refers to is the entirety of his abiding relationship with his disciples. He has loved them all along. And the very next chapter, he'll talk about that he'll be sending another paraclete, right? This one who walks the Spirit, who will walk alongside them just as he did. And so I think that's a helpful thing for people too, to hear that we know how to do this love. We've been doing this love as a congregation for years and years and years together. And so this is not, our love is not limited at this point. That love that we share with each other is not limited. Oh, we can't wash each other's feet, then we can't do it. It is, we've been doing it all along. So how can you help people think about, this is a love that we have lived, and it now just happens to have a different kind of expression, but we know it and we've lived it. And that's in part what Jesus is reminding the disciples of.
And that recognition of the living it is, we forget that the foot washing was not ceremonial. It was a very necessary task of hospitality. And what does that hospitality look like in an act today? Matt, I think you were going to say something.
Well, I was just going to point out in response to what Karoline was saying about he's been loving them all along. It's also been very physical. It's been being with them. It's not going back to their homes. It's eating together. It's partying together. It's reclining on each other at the supper. So again, it's really hard to imagine what does participation with Jesus look like in the Gospel of John that doesn't allow for physical presence or for touch or all of these other things. But we should probably move on. Is that fair, Rolf?
Yeah. It's just what I was going to do. I'd like to go to the 1 Corinthians text. For a lot of congregations, a lot of traditions, the focus on Maundy, Thursday is the institution of the Lord's Supper, which of course you don't get in John, but you do get in the Synoptics and in 1 Corinthians. And this is perhaps even harder for folks at this time. For traditions that focus on the need for an ordained person to preside and have some understanding of real presence, that is it possible to share in the sacrament this year? Reminder, we are recording this podcast at the end of March, excuse me, socially distanced from each other, recording it remotely, and we don't know, but we assume that it still might be that there will be congregations that are not able to gather in person. I know at least one pastor who has in the past presided over communion remotely through a streaming service and told people to get wine and bread. I don't know if that works for people, but it might be possible to in traditions where the sacraments are in the same way that a sacrament might be distributed by lay ministers to those in what am I trying to say, who are shut-ins and then shared. It could be possible to pre-distribute the elements, but for those who feel distanced from a very central part of their piety, this day might be very difficult, and it might be hard to really to get to the core of the day for some people.
I have to confess, I'm still trying to work through how we do that in this technological capacity. I'm grateful for because of the necessity in this moment. But before we came to this moment, it troubled me, and so I'm going to take a different take from where you just went, Ralph. Just as a creative thought, not to disagree. I want to be clear with folks who see that as a permission giving. I'm not taking that away, but it's something else to think about. A few years ago, I was reading a book. I think it was by John Howard Yoder, and he described the table, just eating with others in fellowship, in a way that made me, as a single person who lives alone, very aware that every time I broke bread, I wanted to remember the presence of Christ. That every time I was in community with another, I wanted to be aware that God is the one who supplies my every need, including my bread and my sustenance and drink. But I also wanted to honor that community because most of the time I eat alone. And so in thinking of celebrating this particular sacrament, what if we think of the way that this would have been in ancient Israel, a family celebrating this traditional meal of remembering the rescue of God. And that is what the communion table has come for us, remembering the presence of God for us. And what if our regular tables, just with our families, become that? That's a new way of looking at it, and it sort of fits with seeing what does foot washing look like in a social distancing context. It looks like separating ourselves. That's caring for the other, and maybe remembering that when Paul is talking here about a meal, I don't think it's a ceremonial meal. It is actually a meal where folks are gathering together and they need that substance. So how do we do that? I don't know, can you Zoom a meal call with somebody else?
I think here's maybe one thing you can do, and this is with regard to 1 Corinthians. This is the last thing I want to say, but Paul's pretty clear that as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And we can all say things that are going to get people's sacramental panties in a bunch. Can I say that? But let me say this, that as I understand that, Paul's saying this is the purpose of the meal, is to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. At least one of the purposes of the meal. We do that in a variety of ways. I think you both have illustrated what that can look like, that take us beyond the rules. But it's also, one of the things that worries me about the current moment is the way the table's closed off to those who can't wander in the door, or those who don't have access to high-speed internet. So what does that look like? How does the church bear witness to the death of Christ until he comes. Maybe some of that comes by making sure if you're out shopping that you put stuff in the bin for the food shelf that's there. Maybe it's you sign up to be one of the people who delivers food to people who can't go out and shop on their own and leave stuff on their desk. You know, and there are ways in which that is also sacramental, at least in this present time. And so again, it's back to the creativity of finding ways to proclaim the same stuff that we always proclaim, but using new methods or new media to do it.